Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be reviewing a code base. I was on Twitter recently and I saw this relatively cool project by Evan. It's called the Single File Component Playground. We're going to take a look at this project and then we're going to go over the code base and see how it all works. There's some pretty nice tricks and I learned a few things going over this code base. Let's go ahead and take a look. So you can see here we have the Single File Component Playground. It's basically a little environment to sort of prototype and play around with Vue components. You can see we have a few different tabs. Over here on the left we have our single file component, and over here on the right, let me make that a bit bigger, we have our actual output. So in this case it's a very simple hello world. We also have a few more interesting things. You can see here we have the actual compiled code. So what Vue is going to do is take this and compile it into this mess here, and then eventually we're going to have something we can execute in a browser. You can kind of see how this correlates to this. We have our template and we have our script tag, and we start off by creating a bunch of imports. For example, toDisplayString. You can probably imagine what this is going to do. It's going to display a string, and lo and behold, we have a string. The next thing we're going to do is create this variable. It's going to be the single file component. We have our variable here for message, and then we have effectively our render function. It's going to create a new block, then it's going to create a new block inside that, and it's going to have a h1 that's over here. We then have no props and we're displaying our display string. Finally, we set up our exports and we have our module. We can actually change this from script setup to be a normal script component and see how it's a little bit different. In fact, what I'm going to do is actually create a new component, which you can do as well. Let's go ahead and try this one out. I'm going to change this one from script setup just to script, and we're going to quickly write our very simple component and see what it does. And you might be surprised, the output is actually slightly different here. Let's go ahead and just return this variable, so we'll paste it in here, and then we're just going to return message. And that should get us something we can compare. And you can see immediately this code is a little bit longer. The first thing you'll notice is the top is different. We have instead analyzed bindings, message, string, maybe ref, and if we go back to the previous one, we have setup const. So it's a little bit different here. It seems like the single file component is pretty smart, or the compiler is very smart. It's able to figure out this is going to be a static message, so it's definitely going to be a constant. On the other hand, if we look at the other component, it's a little bit different. It says setup maybe ref, and I guess what's happening here is it's not able to figure out this is not going to be a ref. The main difference here is to do with ref unwrapping. For example, if we come in here, it's going to actually give us the value right if we're using a ref. This is called ref unwrapping, and this is something we're going to have to check for all of these variables. If it's a ref, we're going to extract the value. It seems like when we're using script setup, this is not the case. It immediately knows this is not going to be a ref. If it was a ref, it would look different. It would be something like ref. And this is going to then give us that ref. And you can see here, it knows it's a ref. So this is a little bit more of an intelligent compiler if you're using setup instead of script. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but that's kind of the point of this application. You can sort of go through and experiment and see how things change. And this is a nice quick feedback loop to see exactly how the compiler is working. Another cool thing is you're able to share these URLs. So it's actually going to keep all of this and compile it to a base64 encoded string and paste it up here. Now you can go and share your component with your friends. That's pretty neat. Another more interesting and probably realistic use case would be sharing an error or maybe something strange you found in the compiler or reporting a bug. There are some other things we can do here as well. For example, if we go ahead and create a style scoped, we can see how scoped modules are going to work as well. Let's go ahead and just create that and give it a very basic styling of, let's say, h1, and you can see now this output is different again. We have this with ID function, and this is going to create this unique ID, the F13B, whatever it is. And we have that down here again, and this is how scope styling works. If we come over to the CSS, we can see that exact same code is here. So that's how Vue is going to be able to scope any styling here into this component. It's going to use this ID and kind of correlate to that. Finally, we have the SSR tab. I haven't really looked at this too much, but this is basically server-side rendering, and you can see the code it generates is slightly different. We have this SSR render attributes tag, and it's doing whatever it does. I haven't done too much SSR with Vue 3, so I'm not too concerned, but this is a good way to experiment again. I can easily see how my code is going to change on the server or in the client. Anyway, now that we know what this application does, let's actually go ahead and dive into the code base and see how this all works. This is another cool opportunity to see how Evan actually writes his code and sets up his components. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually run this. If you come over here, I'm in the Vue Next repository inside of Single File Component Playground. If you do want to try this out, you need to install all the packages. So you would go to the top level here and just do a yarn build. Finally, you're going to come into this package inside of SFC Playground and just do yarn vite and start up the server. Of course, we're using vite, so it's going to be very, very fast. I have this warning here, but I think I can safely ignore this. Let's head over to the browser and give it a try. So I have my local version here, and that's running just fine, and you can see it is exactly the same. Let's go ahead and take a look at the code base and see what's going on. So we have the code base here. We're just going to go through everything quickly, especially the boring parts, and then we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into the more interesting parts. So we have our source directory here, and you can see this code base is not very big. It is fairly approachable. If we start jumping through it, we have some utilities which are not very interesting. We have split pane, and this split pane component is how we're able to do this. This is actually resizable, and you can see it's not moving completely perfectly smoothly. I have to move it a little bit to actually resize, and we're going to see how that works right now. This is kind of a little trick I hadn't seen before. We have this drag move function here, and I hadn't seen this operator, and this is actually pretty neat. I'm just going to do a console log and show you what this value is, so you have an idea of what's happening here. If you have seen this before, it's probably not very interesting for you, but I hadn't seen it and I thought it was pretty neat. So if we move this, we're getting a round number. It's always going to be a whole number between 0 and 100, and that's exactly what this is doing. This is basically something called a bitwise NOT. So for example, if you have a binary number, maybe something like this, and you do a bitwise NOT, you get the opposite values. And we're doing 2 of them, so we're basically cycling through and getting back to where we started. This might seem kind of pointless, but actually what it's going to do is truncate all of the decimal places, because when you convert to binary, you're going to truncate those. So this is basically a very easy way to get rid of all the decimal places and get a whole number. And that's exactly what's happening here. We're not getting any decimal numbers, and that's how we're able to get this nice smooth transition here without any sort of like a buggy movement. If you just do it, the movement on every single time it changes, including the float numbers, it probably won't seem as smooth and it might not be as performant. Anyway, I just thought that was pretty neat. I hadn't seen this one before. Let's keep on going through this anyway. So the first thing I'm going to do is just undo all that changes, and then we're going to continue on here. We have this message component, and we're starting to see the compilation stuff going on behind here. We have this compiler error here and the line of code, and it's going to give us a warning if we make any mistakes. Just to show you how that works, I'm going to go ahead and make a bunch of mistakes, and now we're going to get this warning. So this component here is that warning component, and hopefully we can get some kind of better output here. There's probably some way to get a specific log or error message. I'm not too sure what it is, but anyway, there we go. How did I do that? Okay, so if you have valid JavaScript, you're going to get an actual warning here, and it's going to give me the exact location in here with a little arrow. It's gone now, but it was there. And you can see we're getting the line of code here as well, as opposed to just completely uncompilable JavaScript, which is just going to give us a warning here. Anyway, let's keep on going. If we head over here, we have the main application, which is pretty boring. We're just importing this and mounting it. Finally, we have the header. This is also fairly uninteresting. There is the ability to download a project here, and this is pretty neat. What this does is actually download this project as it is, so with a vite template, and you can run it locally. And the template is somewhere over here inside of download. The next thing is going to be the output. We're actually going to come back to this because this is understanding this requires you to understand everything else that's going on. We have the code editor here, which is not especially interesting, but we do have to know that we're using a store here. So there's a little localized store that's being created, and we're going to keep an eye on the code every 250 milliseconds, and then we're going to go ahead and propagate that to the store, and that's going to trigger a compilation. Another thing I saw here which was pretty neat was this watch function. I hadn't seen this before, but you can pass a callback to watch, and you can go ahead and watch a property of a reactive object. I was normally passing a ref in here, but if you want to watch a part of a reactive object, you can pass a callback and just pass in the value. In this case, we're watching the active file name. When the active file name changes, apparently we're going to go ahead and update the active code and change it to this one, and that makes perfect sense. What this is doing is watching when the active file changes, so if I have many components and I change the file, it's going to go ahead and recompile the code and give me my new component over here. So yeah, that does make perfect sense. I do still have an error here, let's go ahead and fix that up. Okay, head back to the code base and keep on going. So the next thing we have is the file selector. Again, this is not very interesting, it's just those tab components. The next thing we're going to check out is the output, and this is where things start to get pretty interesting. Before we do that, actually, we probably need to see the store, and this is where all the compilation happens. So this is going to then drive the output. So let's have a look through here first. Scrolling up to the top, we're importing a bunch of things from the compiler SFC, including pass and compile template, compile script, and so on and so forth. We need all of these because we're going to have to compile all of this here into actual JavaScript. You can see we have our default template here. That's exactly what was there when I first opened the website. Let's continue scrolling down, and this is where things start to get a bit more cool. Just to give you some context on what's actually happening here, let's head back to Twitter, and you can see here there's a post that says, "This project also includes an ad hoc setup that rewrites a bunch of cross-importing ESM source code, da 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 da." So what is actually happening here? We have this iframe here. This is actually an iframe, and it has its own isolated Vue instance. So we have its own Vue import here, and we have a component, and we're going to go ahead and sandbox this from the actual application. So there's going to be two Vue imports running here. We have one Vue, which is going to be the whole application, and we have another import for Vue down here, which is going to be isolated from the main instance. And that's exactly what this is referring to. We have another import of Vue, which is going to be used inside of the iframe. Now that we've seen that, let's keep on going down, and we're going to come back to this when we get to the output directory and see how this is all set up. We have some other things like creating a class of file, which is not that interesting. We're just holding the file name, the code, and the compiled code. We have JS and CSS, which does make sense. We've seen both of those so far. Scrolling down a little bit more, we have our store. We're going to have a hash map of files. So we're going to map the name of the file to the actual file. We have the current active file, and we have any errors. Continuing down here, we see that URL hashing here. And this is where we're saving the code into the URL. So we're doing this JSON pass, and we're passing this into a binary or a base64 encoded string, and then it's going to be encoded up here. So that's how you're able to easily share your components with your friends. That's what's happening here. Finally, continuing down, we actually create the store, and it's just a reactive object. And you can see that's how we were watching this active file before, using watch, passing in that callback. Finally, we have some getters and some errors. Nothing too exciting going on here. We do have a watcher here. Every time the active file changes, we are going to compile it. Again, that makes sense as well. Continuing down, we have a few more watch effects, not especially interesting, and we should get to a file, which is a function here, and that is going to be compile file. And this is the bulk of the code in this file. We're going to go ahead and attempt to compile everything, and this is going to sort of show you how the single file component compiler works. Scrolling down a bit more, we have some checks, and now we're doing pass. And what this is going to do is pass the string, which you pass in here, including all of this. So it's going to take this and split it up into a bunch of different properties, which we can then go ahead and handle. So you can see here we get something called a descriptor, and this is where most of the information is going to be stored. Scrolling down a little bit, we have descriptor.script, descriptor.script setup, and descriptor.styles, and descriptor.template. So you can see what's happening. It's splitting this up into 4 different parts. We have template, we have script setup, we might have style, and you can also have a script alongside your script setup and do something else in here. For example, you might have some exports. If you want to export things, you need to do it down here. You can't export those from script setup. So if you wanted to do something like this, you could. So that's what's happening here. We're going and breaking all of these down and figuring out what to do. Following on, we're now going to handle the script code here. And basically our goal is going to be building up what you see over here. It's going to take all of it and paste it together. So we're starting off with our script or our script setup, scrolling down here and compiling that. And then we get this output here, and you can see analyze bindings is appearing here, and that also appears over here. So we're starting to see how things get built up. Continuing down, we're just going to constantly add onto this final code string, and we're building up this big blob of JavaScript. There's another very similar implementation to this over in this repository called Vue.js, and this is exactly what Vue.js does as well. It takes a Vue component, it uses the Vue single file compiler, it smushes it all together in this one gigantic string, and that's something Jest is able to read. If you are interested in this, you can see it inside of generate code. We have this big function which just goes ahead and basically appends all these strings together. Anyway, now that you've seen that, let's continue on with our exploration of this code base. So we're constantly going through and building up this giant string. Eventually we finish building up this string, or for the script tag anyway. Now we're onto the template, and this is going to give us a render function. We can see that over here. It's building up this part down here. This is part of rendering the component. If we go ahead and remove this and make this into just a script one, it's no longer going to be valid, but it does make it a bit more clear. So I'm just going to go ahead and add the most minimal possible component just to get something working. And I think that should be enough. We are still not getting a render function. Let's just go ahead and delete this one. And now we are. You can see it's giving us this render function. So this template is going to turn into this part down here. And then we're going to add it onto SFC as the render function. Let's keep on moving down. So we have a bunch more stuff. We go ahead and do this, and there is our render export. And that's exactly what I just showed you, right? We have a single file component .render is equal to render. Scrolling down, we have some more stuff. We're now doing the styling as well. Continuing down, continuing down, continuing down. We made it to the bottom. So now we have eventually taken this over here and changed it into some actual JavaScript code. But this is still not enough to get anything executed. We're pretty close, but not quite there. The next thing we need to do is import this as a module into our preview and then render it. And I actually have broken something, so let's quickly fix this up just so we can see it working. All we need to do is return a message, and that's just going to be something. And with a bit of luck, this should now be working. No, it shouldn't. Now it should be working. Great. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and see what's happening. Jumping back here, we've finally made it to the output folder, and this is where all the magic happens. Let's just jump into these files and see what's going on. And there's an important message to read up the very top here, saying where this code came from. So you can see this file, preview proxy, as well as source.html, came from something called the sort REPL, which I'm guessing is kind of the same thing as what we have here. This source.html is going to be what's rendered inside of preview. So if we jump over here, that's going to be the code here inside of the iframe. And there's a bunch of stuff going in here. I haven't really read over this, but you can see it's basically setting up for the imports. If you have a lot of time on your hands, you could go ahead and figure out what exactly is going on here. I haven't really done it yet, but you can sort of imagine what's happening. We're just setting up for our imports. We have some other checks in here for different error messages. Anyway, let's keep on going down. The next thing is going to be this preview proxy file, and this one is also helping out with the source doc just to set up some of those imports. The final thing we're going to look at is inside of module compiler. Preview hasn't got too much going on. We did see this a little bit earlier, I think. Or maybe we didn't. Okay, we should just quickly look at this one now. So this is going to be the component which is previewing. That's going to be this component right here. Jumping inside of here, we have the source doc we just saw, and we have the message we've seen before. And scrolling down a little bit, we have the sandbox URL. And now we're setting up our imports. So you can see here, we're going to go window.modules, and this is where our SFC is eventually going to be. We're now going to import app, and that's going to come from a different Vue instance, so not the one that's powering this application. We then go ahead and unmount any app that previously existed, and then we're going to create a new one. And this is where the most important part is. Let's go ahead and do a console log and see what's inside of these modules. So if I just do a console log and go ahead and say modules, we should see something interesting. Saving this one off, heading back to the browser, we should see an output. I'm actually got an error message here. Let's see if we can fix it up, and I'm missing a bracket. Now that we fixed that one up, we're going to have something a bit better. Here we go. We have this module, and this is going to be our app, and it's going to create a module we can actually go ahead and render. Jumping inside of here, we see render and setup, and this seems like something pretty reasonable that Vue is going to be able to take and render. It's a Vue component. Moving on, we have not a whole lot else. We do some other things to set up the preview, and finally we're going to go ahead and see module compiler and see how we actually got that default export. So the goal here is going to be creating a module, something we can actually go ahead and consume as an ES module. So we set up a few different keys here, and then we're going to continue scrolling down, and we're basically going to be passing the string that we just passed. So just to confirm what's going on here, we have this JavaScript code here, and we need to turn this into an ES module, something that can be imported. So we're going to have to pass this, and we're going to use Babel to do it, or at least that's my understanding of what's happening here. You can see here we're importing Babel pass, magic string, walk, and a few other things, and this is part of the compiler. Scrolling down here, we can see what's happening. We have some similar logic to the Vue SSR transform. I don't know what that is, so I can't comment too much, but let's continue down and see what process file actually does. So we have our compiled code, the JavaScript and the CSS, and those two are coming from here in these two tabs, I presume. Finally, we're going to go ahead and pass that and build up something called an abstract syntax tree, and that's going to give us basically a way to handle all of that code. Just to show you what's going on here, I'm going to log the AST, head back to my browser and refresh, and we should see an object. We're seeing 6 different nodes, and what these are going to be referring to is the different parts of this. The first one is the variable declaration, and that's going to be this const here. The next one is an import, it's going to be the import. The next one's a function. We then have expression, and export. So that's this, and this. So you can see we've taken this and turned this into something we can actually traverse and handle. Basically using this, we're going to go ahead and see what kind of nodes we're on. So do we have an import node? Do we have a different sort of node? And so on and so forth. and we just keep on going down here, and it's basically commented exactly what's going on. We're going to grab all of the imports and handle those. Going to continue down here and see if we have an import default specifier. We have the export name declaration, which we've seen before. We haven't actually, but sorry about that. It is going to be if you're exporting a named export. We haven't got a named export here. We have a default export. So we're going to continue on, and different things are going to happen. Scrolling down, scrolling down, scrolling down. You can see there's a different node or a different part of this statement to handle each one of these statements. So we're going to figure out what we need to do to turn this into an ES module. Continue scrolling down, there's other things happening as well. And eventually, if we get down to the bottom of this file, we're going to hopefully return something that we can use. I think we have to head up and find the bottom of that function rather. Let's see if we can do that really quickly, just so we get an idea of what's going on. This is a very big file and a very big function. I think it's going to start from here. No, a little bit further up, process file, here we go. So this is the end. We end up with this processed output. We should probably go ahead and have a look at this just so we get an idea of what we started with and what we're ending with. Heading back here and refreshing, this is what we eventually get. We get this big messy string, and that's actually what you're going to see eventually down here as your ES module. And finally, we have something we can actually import and use in our iframe. We did skip over a lot of details here, mainly because I don't fully understand all the details, but that's sort of the idea of how this works. And that's what Evan was talking about here in his post when he said there's a project also includes an ad hoc setup with a bunch of rewrites. If you do have more knowledge about this, feel free to comment and correct any mistakes I might have made. But yeah, I think this is a really interesting project, and you can learn a lot from going through these big complex open source code bases. This is not the kind of thing you encounter in day-to-day programming unless you're working on a compiler or something like that, so it's definitely a good learning opportunity. Finally, he says here, does require a JS parser, and that's what he was talking about over here when we jump up and we import Babel. I don't think there's any problem with that. It's just a little bit of an interesting aside. It's a very cool project, and I definitely encourage you to check this one out. Just because of the code base, it's so small, so it's entirely possible you can sit down for a day and just understand everything that's going on. I'm looking forward to seeing how this develops. I'm sure Evan has more things up his sleeve that he's going to add to this, so definitely go ahead and check this one out. Finally, if you're still watching, thank you very much. I finally hit 1,000 subscribers, which is very exciting, and I'm sort of experimenting with different content. So this is my first sort of video diving into a different code base and just commenting on it. If you did enjoy this, please let me know and I'll make more of them. If you didn't, go ahead and thumbs down it and I'll know that these suck and I will stop making them. Anyway, until next time, I'll see you in the next video.